Playing The Stillness of the Wind was a strange experience during the early months of 2020. It is a game in part about isolation, which we all have been experiencing to one degree or another. There was a difference, though, between the isolation I experienced in the urban environment of the city around me and the one I experienced in the quasi-wilderness environment of The Stillness of the Wind. In both I experienced isolation, yet one experience of isolation was driving me bonkers, while the other one was one I yearned for. This was because how nature existed in relation to me affected how I experienced isolation. Human beings have an obsession with control and shaping the world around them to what they believe is a better design. In this vein, urban environments are the ones to have the most control exercised over them in order to maintain the order of the larger population crammed together. But in exercising this control, we ignore nature to our detriment. In a lot of ways, shaping urban environments has involved pushing nature away from us. We confine it to parks, trees in front of homes, yards, gardens, zoos, and so on, and we barely pay any attention to how the urban sprawl affects wildlife. We board ourselves up in the walls of our homes where access to nature becomes work, and work not everyone has the same access to. A wall is built between us and nature, and the place of nature within urban environments often comes as an afterthought. In The Stillness of the Wind, you play as Talma. The game is about the ebbs and flows of running your farm. Every morning you wake up and decide which tasks to complete. Once you have completed your work for the day, you return to your cozy little home to eat and do some light reading. The game starts off like a really light farm sim, but none of the gameplay loops are that intense. The pacing of the gameplay hits a sweet spot where doing everything becomes meditative in nature. This allows the player to reflect on the bubbling narrative in the background, mostly told through letters and dialogue with the only other person you see. I would start most mornings by collecting eggs for my chickens, then I would usually feed and milk my goats. The rest of my day would be spent tending to my garden, making cheese, or picking mushrooms. Most days I would be visited by the trader. He would give me any mail I had, and I could purchase any needed supplies. Once my day was done, I would return to my little house and make myself some dinner. Afterwards, I would usually read the mail I had received. These are usually letters from family and friends who long ago left for the city. This is how most of my days went, but sometimes I would walk not far from my little farm and remember things from days long past. Some days there would be rain and I couldn't get any work done, and some nights I would be bothered by wolves. But even here, where I seem so far from the rest of the world, trouble comes. A darkness is born in the city, and eventually it finds its way to me. In my final days, I tried to keep my farm, my home, alive, but slowly the darkness takes my garden, my chickens, and my goats. Finally, cold and alone, I die. The narrative of The Stillness of the Wind is conveyed in a very abstract way through letters most of the time, but sometimes supplemented by dream sequences and dialogue with the trader. Some sort of catastrophic event takes place in the city. The nature of this event is kept vague, but slowly over time you begin to feel its effects. There are increased wolf attacks. Your chickens begin to go missing one by one. The skies darken and strange weather events start to occur. Your power goes out and eventually you run out of supplies. You are left in a weakened state and things seem to get worse. The trader comes to say goodbye. Then one morning you wake up to snow-covered ground and you walk outside and die from exhaustion. One of the themes of The Stillness of the Wind is isolation. While playing the game, I was isolated due to the lockdown, but in the game itself I was also living out a life of isolation. But I would have taken the isolation in The Stillness of the Wind any day over the real-life isolation I was experiencing. Humans are social creatures, and we yearn for a connection to others. Complete isolation can be a nightmare. Some forms of isolation are preferable to others. I'd rather take the isolation of my apartment or the isolation of solitary confinement in prison. When I talk about the isolation of The Stillness of the Wind and how I prefer to the isolation of my apartment in lockdown, I'm not trying to idealize isolation. I'm exploring how my relationship to nature in a given environment affects how I experience isolation. In fact, the isolation of The Stillness of the Wind comes with its own melancholy moments in regards to isolation, but still I had a desire to be on that farm. It's hard to put into words the yearning I felt to really be there in the stillness of the wind. I had already been pretty much trapped inside my apartment in Chicago for about a month or two when I played the game. I wanted to be there, where I could just gently rise with the sun, where I could go and greet my chickens and goats, where the rhythms of my life could line up with the rhythms of the world around me. Being isolated in an urban environment is draining, and in regards to our relationship to nature, I think there are two reasons why isolation in the stillness of the wind is preferable to the isolation in my urban apartment. The first reason is just access to nature itself. Like I mentioned before, urban environments exercise a high degree of control over nature, and we like to confine nature to allowed spaces. There's a large park about a 10-minute walk from where I live, but if I look out my window, it's mostly just a concrete courtyard. Urban living creates this barrier between you and nature, one you have to traverse in order to experience it. You either have to go out and engage with nature in parks or other green spaces, or you have to bring nature into your home. But even when you do these things, there is still a feeling of this barrier. There is this element of confining nature, because for so long this is the way we thought it needed to be with regards to nature in our urban environments. The place of nature in urban life has always been an uneven priority. On some level we know we need it, and research has shown that access to nature and interaction with it is vital to our mental health. But even when I go out to interact with nature, where we have allowed it to thrive in the urban landscape, I can still feel that barrier, something there that says we are separate. The farm in the stillness of the wind exists somewhere between the rural and the wilderness. Existing more in the wilderness, there is no one else around you, and the only other person you see is the trader who seems to travel the countryside every day, and any evidence of a greater human presence has long since returned to nature. And in the wilderness, you don't create a barrier with nature, you share a space with it. Nature is there with you morning, night, and day. In an urban landscape for a lot of people, nature isn't there when they work. You work in retail, food service, have an office job, or any other job that keeps you inside most of the day, and you're deprived of nature 8+ hours of the day. And even now, the problem is exacerbated by stay-at-home restrictions, where working from home can deprive you even further of access to nature. In the stillness of the wind, there is little to no barrier between you and nature. The second you step out the front door, it is there with you always. Even if you stayed inside, nature is just outside your window, boundless and unimpeded like an ocean. Everything you do involves some interaction with nature. Need to collect eggs or milk the goats? You're engaging with nature. Tending to your garden for vegetables? Engaging with nature. Days of bad weather may impede some of your days, but you still have to engage with nature. In an urban environment, bad weather would most likely persuade you to not engage with nature. But on the farm, sharing space with nature, you still have to check your chickens, feed your goats. These are things you have to do in order to survive. When you share space with nature, you have to engage with it. When we create barriers with nature, it becomes a luxury, one that can too easily be forgotten about, or like most luxuries, becomes harder to access for some people due to privilege. Another aspect that makes the isolation of the wilderness and the stillness of the wind more bearable is the feeling of being more in sync with the world. When you live in the city, you're never truly in sync with the world around you. Everyone is moving at different speeds, and the city itself is just constantly going and going. You have your own personal rhythms, but they never quite feel in line with anyone else's or anything else. Living in a constant state of desynchronization is an experience of urban life we don't think enough about. But in the wilderness of the stillness of the wind, there is an ecstasy of feeling in sync with the world. At the end of the day, we forget we are part of nature, not separate from it, and definitely not above it. The greater we make that barrier in urban environments, the more we cut ourselves off from a vital part of our existence. Isolation in the wilderness isn't as bad as in urban environments, because even though there may be no one around, you still feel a part of the world. But in urban environments, you're surrounded by people, but can feel like you're never really connected to anything. On that farm in the stillness of the wind, we have to engage with nature in order to survive. And in order to best engage with nature, we have to be in sync with it. You can't survive in the ocean by fighting against its currents, and you can't survive in the wilderness by fighting against the currents of nature. You get up every morning with the sun, and you need to get your work done before the sun sets. And the rhythms of nature dictate what you are able to accomplish that day. Even at night, you are never out of sync with nature, because the threat of wolf attacks keeps you engaged with the nature around you. And as you are working throughout the day, All the other life is working at the same pace as you are to survive another day in the wilderness. Isolation can be rough. To feel alone and disconnected from the world can have a real detrimental effect on our mental health, but some forms of isolation are preferable to others, and one thing that greatly affects how we experience isolation is the place of nature and the environment around us. In an urban environment, the barrier between us and nature and feeling out of sync with nature makes us feel the effects of isolation to a greater degree. In the stillness of the wind, we are able to experience isolation in the wilderness, where there is no barrier between us and nature, where we are in sync with it. We may be isolated in a way, but it is hard to dwell in isolation when you are constantly engaged with nature. That engagement allows us to weather isolation to a greater degree. In the end, sharing space with nature is better for us than when we don't.